Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, to Charles and Mina's associates for getting in touch with me. I was supposed to deliver this briefing earlier, but for unforeseen circumstances, I was not able to. So it's happening now, which should have happened sometime in June or July. So apologies for that. And a heartfelt thank you to Avinash Sutherland, Parm, for hosting me here, and for all of you to coming this morning. I mean, as academics, we are not really accustomed to waking up early in the morning. Let me tell you that. I think in your case, life would be different. Now, I've been working on India, South Asia, for the past few years now. And whenever I think about talking or giving a brief on India and its larger kind of political, economic, strategic landscape, there's this idea, this quote that constantly comes to my mind by a famous British economist from Cambridge, John Robinson, that anything that you can correctly say about this country, the exact opposite is equally true. It's really frustrating. So whenever someone asks me whether I am positive or critical about India, the instinctive thought in my head is that, look, I'm both positive and critical about India at the same time. So over the next sort of 40 minutes, I'll try to actually unpack these contradictions of India instead of giving you a sectorial breakdown, which you can do anyways by yourself. I'll try to put a larger strategic context as to what are the key debates, what are the key policy-making approaches to solve these contradictions that have happened in the past 5 years, and most likely what will happen over the next 5 years. Now, if you think about it, why do I focus on these contradictions? Why is it that I'll be taking a particular framework when I'm trying to communicate this idea? Technically speaking, at this moment, India is a democratic country. It's one of the largest democracy. But at the same time, if you look a bit more closer as to how it's functioning, there are areas, there are spaces, there are geographies in the country where that democratic fabric is contested. In Kashmir, as we speak, for the past more than a month now, there has been a communications lockdown of almost 8 million people. In Northeast, again, there are long-ranging, raging insurgencies, which the government of India historically, I'm not just talking about the Modi government, historically the government of India, whether Congress dominated or BJP dominated, has dealt with a certain degree of coercion. Now, yes, there is an active, flourishing democracy in many ways in Northeast, but at the same time, today we are seeing a potential creation of detention camps where people, whether or not it works out, we do not know. And the government is very clear that it's not a measure in restraining anyone's democratic rights. But at the same time, we are talking about a situation where there is a potential of people being put in detention camps in the state of Assam. Yet it is it's a democratic country. No one can doubt that. No one can deny that. It's secular. It's constitutionally secular. In practice, it has been secular for a long time. But today, if you go back to India, you'll see that there is a very polarized debate on what secularism actually means. What does it actually mean when you're looking at a country that is divided along the lines of caste, along the lines of religion, definitely religion, and is that secularism, has that secularism really served the country well? Or have we looked at what the Congress has often alleged, the Congress party, of doing minority appeasement politics historically and passing that off as secularism? So the idea of India being a democratic secular republic has been constantly debated, constantly challenged, and constantly it has been reworked over the past few decades. So what I'll do, should I go? Yeah. On the way. Perfect. So, in terms of the overview over the next 40 minutes, I'll first give you a brief overview just to get a sense. I don't know how many of you are very comfortable with India, its geography, its larger, the basics of it. So I'll give you a very quick overview of the basics based on which we can have a conversation. Then we'll look at the three contradictions that I think we must focus on as we move forward. The political or the socio-political contradictions. What is it that is at stake? What is it that the country is debating, not just at a high level, but also on the ground level, and which has implications for the health of India's polity as we go forward? What are the economic contradictions? Pam mentioned that, India is actually, it's a rising power. Many consider it to be a risen power, and for good reason. But at the same time, Avinash Sutherland cannot have an office over there. And that tells a story. And that's a story that is worth keeping in mind when you're doing business in a country which has a particular sort of very complicated relationship with anything that is not indigenous. It's open for business, but then there are caveats attached as to how much you can enter, how much you can operate, and in what ways, shapes, and forms. And it's completely asymmetric depending on which state you're working in. And the third is the strategic contradictions. Here's a country which has had a very strong sense of what its foreign policy bearings should be, historically speaking. At the same time, it is today at the cusp of deciding whether we need to have particular alignments in world affairs to meet our immediate foreign policy and long-term foreign policy requirements, or can we have a particular non-aligned perspective on international affairs? What does alignment actually really mean? And this is a contradiction that India has constantly kind of tried to navigate, to some success in some ways, to less success as expected in many others. So these three contradictions will hopefully give you a framework to think about when you move in a direction of doing business in India or with Indian partners. So very quick overview. The map is the 7th largest country in the world, sort of a bridge between the Indian Ocean region, the Middle East, and of course East Asia. Its population today is 1.36 billion, growing at a rate of 1.08%. Now, if you compare per annum, if you compare this to the other two big countries of the United States and China, Chinese population is growing at 0.39%. So essentially, India is set to overtake China fairly quickly in terms of brute numbers, in terms of brute demography. And US is growing at a rate of 0.71%. So it gives you a sense of what the larger demographic profile would be in the coming years and what it actually is today. We are looking at a very populous country, most of which is young. About 50% of India's population is within the age bracket of 22 and 32 years. So you're looking at a lot of young people, a lot of energy, and a lot of aspirational people. It's not a youth which is it's a youth which is very sure about what it wants. It's a youth which wants India to be at a certain place and wants itself to be at a certain place. Whether it happens or not is a different matter. But these are the aspirations. So a lot of young people, highly aspirational, religious, multi-religious, constitutionally secular, as I said. 80.5% of the population of India is it's Hindu. Whether they practice or not is a different thing. 13.4% is Muslim, 2.3% Christian, 1.9% Sikh, 0.8% Buddhist, and 1.1 is various other religions. This becomes very important. This becomes very important, especially when we come to the socio-political contradictions of India. How does religion play out on a day-to-day level and in the larger political discourse of the country? It's central to understand today how India is debating its political life. And it's not just unique to India, it's actually unique to the whole region. It's religion, partition since 1947. There have been different ways the states have tackled the question of religion, and how it tackles today has become much more salient with the rise of the Hindu nationalist right-wing party. The political system, as I mentioned, is parliamentary. It's a parliamentary democratic republic with areas in the northeast and in Kashmir which are under certain legal clauses which allows the Indian Armed Forces to have much more coercive approach towards governance and towards security issues. Two big political parties, BJP is the biggest, as Farm mentioned. This is a very stable polity. Despite all the debates, it's actually a very, very stable polity. As we'll come to it in a bit, the Hindu right wing, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, is the main ruling party. And as of today, there's no credible opposition. There are very credible opposition in terms of ideas, but in terms of parliamentary numbers, the Congress and the rest of the regional parties put together, they come nowhere close to what the sitting government has in terms of numbers and popular appeal. It's actually a government which has considerable appeal among the people. Economic sectors, again, sector-wise, if you divide services, agriculture, manufacturing should have been India's strength. Traditionally, it was an agrarian economy. The idea was, as it transitioned out of agrarian sector, it should have been a manufacturing power. Because if you think about a rising power, if you think about China, it's the industrial base that really matters. In case of India, the boom happens not because of manufacturing, it happens because of service sector. And service sector of a particular kind and a particular moment in time of the 1990s, the IT boom, among many others, which became very important. And that is under a certain degree of strain as we speak today with technological evolution. So this gives you a larger picture. Now superimpose on this a very complex caste system, and that will give you a good semblance. I mean, I'm not going to go into the caste system, trust me, that's too complicated to cover in 40 minutes. But these are the kind of questions, these are the kind of issues which animate India's political life on a day-to-day basis. I mean, one thing that Indians are particularly proud of are that they're hardcore constitutionalists, but at the same time, they question the constitution. They kind of really engage with the state in some very personal ways, in some very intimate ways, whether it's in the courts or otherwise. And that is a conversation that will continue going on regardless of which political party is in power. So the first key socio-political contradiction that I want you to think about, and think about not in a sense of taking partisan sides between one or the other, or come with a value judgment, is this idea, and slightly simplistic, but this contradiction, this strain between the idea of a secular India and that between Hindu nationalist India, Hindutva, as it is called. Now, this is a very salient political fault line along which India's politics has panned out electorally over the past 7 years, or the past 6 years at least. At least. It has happened much before that, but there has been a seismic shift, if you think about it, in the favor of Hindu nationalist right-wing forces starting 2014, when there was a very clear sense that, look, this idea of secularism as espoused by the Congress, which holds secularism very deeply to its political heart, was essentially a way of vote bank politics in which there was a lot of minority appeasement goes on. Minority appeasement is essentially a code word for Congress, a particular political party, giving positive, affirmative, playing favorites with the Muslim communities or other minorities in different pockets across the country at the expense of the larger Hindu majority. That's putting it in brass tacks. That, coupled with a lot of economic failure, a lot of corruption, gave to a sense that, look, this is something that we have to change. This is something, and you see a very steady, a very calibrated rise of the majoritarian Hindu right. It starts much more in the late 80s and early 90s, but it really manifests itself in terms of popular appeal in 2014 national elections. If you look at the numbers, it was considered to be a Modi wave, with a very powerful figure on the top, with a lot of appeal across social strata, across region, across age, across gender, in which this one political figure who's considered to be very powerful, very effective, very effective in terms of governance. Of course, practicalities are much more complicated, but this is a very strong perception that Narendra Modi can deliver. 2014 is the break-even, is the departure point. It wins 336 out of 545 seats in the parliament. In 2019, everyone thought that this would change, that they have maxed out in terms of their parliamentary numbers. There was anti-incumbency against the Congress. It was not really ideological. India is still, the secular credentials are still strong. But what we see is something very different. In 2019, they actually came with a larger majority than what they had seen in 2014, both as a single party and as a political coalition. The numbers are today at 353 if you combine the whole BJP-led coalition in the government, and 303 for a single party alone, and the total number of seats are 545. So you can see how important, how in terms of the political fulcrum, the conversation has shifted firmly in favor of the BJP and the Hindu right. Now, one thing that has to be said here is, regardless of the conversation, the fulcrum of the conversation shifting right, it's not as if communalism it's a preserve of the Hindu right. Communalism, and this is why I said the religious politics is important, was practiced and played upon by other political parties for electoral gain when they were in power as well. You go back and look at the history of the Congress-dominated India, and you'll see that, wait, It's not, they say it's secular, but then there are issues in which there's very clear playing with communal passions. If you go back to Indira Gandhi, for instance, in the 1970s and early 80s, you can essentially see that the Kashmir insurgency, which starts in 87, if you want an annual breakup, if you want a historical kind of marker, but there is very clear inflammation for rational political purposes, immediate rational political purposes, to actually support radical Sikh and radical Muslim outfits in both Kashmir and in Punjab. And essentially, what it does is it neutralizes the back of more moderate elements which were competing against Congress hegemony in the states, but leads to a much more stronger backlash against the state of India because of radical nationalist ideas and radical ideologies in both these states, the remnants of which, much less in Punjab, but in Kashmir, are still there to see as we look and focus at India-Pakistan bilateral relations and India's approach in Kashmir. So it is not just that the Hindu right wing is playing along particular religious lines. There is a larger history of how religion has been dealt or ill-dealt by the governments of the day, which takes us to three core issues within, if you're looking at these political contradictions. Polarization. I don't know how many of you followed Indian politics over the past 5-6 years, but you can see that this is a very polarized polity. I mean, over the past 3 years in UK, we have seen a lot of polarization around the Brexit debate. Imagine that 10 times over, and imagine that as your regular normal. And imagine that it's not just one MP, Joe Cox, who was shot down by a person who had a particular view of the world, but that kind of violence being largely accepted till the time the numbers are low in the political peripheries, also in the political heartland. If you are a supporter of the Hindu right, you would be branded a Bhakt. Bhakt is a blind follower of a particular political group. If you're not, you will be branded a secular. Now, secular is a very interesting kind of wordplay with the term secular. So you're Sikh. And these things are, of course, these things are on the surface. They pan out in social media, they pan out in conversation, but they reflect the quality of conversation that has happened in India over the past few years. Terms like love jihad. What is love jihad? It's essentially telling two individuals who cannot marry each other because one is a Muslim and the other is a Hindu. Usually the man is Muslim and the woman is Hindu. These terms came up. Now they have cycles. This is not an enduring feature, but they come up in different parts of the country at different points in time, and they do have an effect on how politics pans out at that moment, what effect it has on state elections, what effect it has on national elections, and how the broader canvas of conversation is charted. Two clear manifestations today as we speak, as I mentioned earlier, is the state of Jammu and Kashmir and Assam. Jammu and Kashmir, I don't know how many of you have followed, India has abrogated something called the Article 370. In the room, does anyone know anything about Article 370? You have followed it recently? You have, Charles? Yes. It's a classic. Now, Article 370 is it's an article of the Indian Constitution, which was instituted in the 50s, which allows the state of Jammu Kashmir a particular special relationship with the state of India. It allowed Kashmir to have its own prime minister, to have its own legislature, to have its own forms of governance. Only three things were to be kept by the state of India. That was defense, telecommunications, and foreign affairs. The article was supposed to be a temporary measure. It was supposed to recognize that Kashmir had acceded to India in special circumstances, and I'm not going to go into the history of 47, but this is a temporary measure, and eventually Jammu and Kashmir will become an Indian state like any other. That temporary never really changed. Since 1950 till 2019, essentially, we have seen Article 370. There are various sub-articles within the Article 370 of the Constitution, one of which is 35A, which says that no one from outside the state of Jammu and Kashmir can own property or live in Kashmir. If I'm from Delhi, I can go and stay in Kashmir, but I cannot own property to do business. Now, this becomes much more complicated as the insurgency rages. Politics gets much polarized, but this thing was abrogated by the state of India on 5th of August this year. If you go and talk to any Indian, doing this is an article of faith. It cannot be undone because essentially Jammu and Kashmir is an inalienable part of India, and this is something that should have happened for all sorts of reasons, including the idea of secular India much earlier. Why is it that they have special privileges when places like Tamil Nadu or Goa or any other parts of Northeast they don't have? Why is it that the Kashmiris should get that special provision? Go and talk to a person in Jammu and Kashmir, and they'll be like, look, it does not matter what it is an identity issue. The moment India abrogates Article 370, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you've taken the casus belli that has supported insurgency, or Pakistan's cause of keeping the negotiations on Kashmir on with India on an even keel has completely been taken off. If Trump says 2 times that, look, I'll negotiate between India and Pakistan, what will you negotiate now? Earlier you had something to negotiate. Now are you going to say that I'm going to negotiate between India and Pakistan about Indian territory? That's not going to happen. So on one hand, it was a diplomatic, strategic masterstroke. There's no way, and you can see how Pakistan is struggling to figure out what to do. But at the other hand, since 5th of August, there has been a lockdown, a communications lockdown. Very few telephone lines are working, only landlines. The internet is being cut off, only few kiosks has been set up, and there's information asymmetry. Very few people actually know what's going on actually on the ground. Now the question is, you keep on doing that. It's a classic tension between security and liberty. You've clamped down on the liberty of 8 million people. The moment you ease it, there's a lot of anger against the state of India, which can be exploited by Pakistan, but it does not need to do much either, because there is already enough anger against the state of India. How do you deal with that situation? What is the timeline over which you lift it? So this is something that the country is dealing with. And the Hindu right, this conversation, which I said earlier, which had been set in a certain way, actually feeds into justifying the move and perhaps changing the conversation and saying that it's not just Jammu and Kashmir that we held, but also the Pakistani side that we should now change. There's a strategic overhaul that is happening in India's domestic and strategic thinking on these issues. The other one is, of course, the issue of Assam, the National Register of Citizens. Who is a citizen of India and who is not? I won't cover that too much in detail given the paucity of time, but we can do that in the Q&A. The other issue is institutional health. This is very important when you're looking at India. How do the institutions operate? How do they function? How do institutions actually engage with ideology? Till now, till the time you said, okay, in principle, there was a secular government, or with a very healthy dose of left-wing intellectual impetus, institutions were working in a certain way. Till 1991, India was working on socialist 5-year planning models. There was a planning commission who would plan those 5-year models. There were ministries who would manage it. Since 91, we have had a shift in a much more open, free trade, liberalized direction. But the institutions and their health has to be questioned. What are the main institutions when we are looking at the judiciary, the armed forces, the Reserve Bank of India, which is very important, of course, the university, police, and media. Today, there is a sense that some of the institutions have been politically kind of managed always. The Central Bureau of Investigation is generally considered to be the tool of any ruling government, not just a Hindu right, but also the Congress. But in universities, you see something very different happening, that centers which were considered to be traditionally favoring left or center-left thought and ideas, there's a very clear struggle going on, state-supported in some cases, whether it's Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi or in Hyderabad, in Srinagar, not in Kashmir, there's another Srinagar in Himachal Pradesh. There is a sense that we need to change the institutional make, the intellectual make of universities and have much more representation of the conservative right. And that has led to a lot of turbulence when you look at student activism, as well as pushback from the academics who have been there for a long time. You focus on the judiciary. It was unprecedented. A few months back, 4 sitting judges of the Supreme Court came out and said there's too much political meddling going on. This is unprecedented if you think about India's history. Judiciary, the Supreme Court of India has been considered, it's sacred. It's like the Election Commission of India. It's one of the strongest institution that post-colonial independent India has produced. 4 judges are coming and saying there's too much political interference going on. How much is too much? No one can actually say. but there is a sense that that contract between the state and the citizen in the courtroom is under strain, if not under threat. The Reserve Bank of India, very, very important economic institution historically, came under a lot of fire for what we saw as demonetization in 2016. I'll come to it in a sec. So these indicators, how resilient are institutions to political meddling is something that you have to focus on. And it has, again, not to do just with the Hindu right. That kind of political meddling happened even before. But institutions deal with it differently and to different level, which takes us to the last point of political polarization of science and education. We all know about India's space program. It's a fantastic program for a variety of different reasons. I mean, yes, they tried to send a rover to the moon. It did not work, but it's still a very, if you think about the trajectory of India's space program, it's actually a big achievement. It's a big deal. It's indigenous. It's something that India, like the nuclear program, it's all homemade, essentially. But at the same time, you're having ministers and cabinet ministers making statements which are deeply unscientific. Recently, it's being told, I mean, he has given a clarification that maths did not help Einstein discover gravity. I don't know what did, but still, it's reflective. It's indicative that there is a complete mismatch sometimes between how institutions are functioning and thinking and how the larger political conversation is going. And you have to, when you look at the country, you have to figure out how much distancing there is between the two, which takes us to the second issue of economic contradictions. Core issue, Make in India versus protectionism. No country, as I mentioned earlier, has become a risen power or a developed power without a serious industrial base and a manufacturing base. And that is something that the government of India under Modi 1.0 was very acutely aware of. And that is why the whole idea, the whole big program, the big pitch of Make in India, you come, you make in India, we want to develop our manufacturing sector. That is where it came from. But at the same time, there is a whole lot of protectionism as to how much you can actually come in. We want you to come, but we don't want you to come in a way that it becomes difficult for industries, not very developed sometimes, within the country to actually function, because you'll be competition. And there are lobbies for both political reasons and for reasons of state that we cannot let you in beyond the point. Even with import duties, open for trade, but one of the highest record levels of import tariffs which were imposed last year by the country. So there is that contradiction which the Indian government has always dealt with, and not just this government, but any government has dealt with. If you look at the breakdown, the services sector is at 54, it contributes 54.5% of the gross value added. Manufacturing is at 29.73, and agriculture is at 15.87. Within manufacturing, almost 50% of the gross value added comes from the auto industry, the car industry. And that industry over the past few months has seen 30% decline in its sales figures. Its production has gone down, and an industry which is employing almost 35 million people, formally and informally put together, is facing a huge slowdown. And according to the Ministry of Statistics data, in the last quarter of 2019, April to June, the rate of growth had come down from 7 to 5%. This is a huge hit. This is a serious hit. The sector which should be your core driving economic driving force is facing a meltdown. Now, there are couple of reasons for that. One thing is, of course, the general demand has gone down. There is a depression in how consumer demand and consumer behavior happens. So it's intrinsic. But then there are other systemic issues. India's car manufacturing is still part of the global supply chain, and it is not really alienated or cushioned against the US-China trade war that is going on. So there are two pinch points that have come together at the same time, which has become raised serious issues about where really is the country going. The Modi government has done something which any government, very classic Indian response, inject money into the system. India's growth traditionally has been bolstered by state spending, by government spending. This is not a growth which happens because of dynamism of different industries. Today we are seeing not just the auto industry, even agricultural output has gone down. Services are also struggling. So the banking sector is facing a huge challenge. They have streamlined 10 banks into 4 banks to strengthen their capability to offer credit. How do you deal with these issues? So what they did recently was took 1.76 trillion rupees, 10 or 20 billion dollars, I'm not sure about the exact figure, from the Reserve Bank of India, and they have injected it into the economy. Where and how is still not known because the answer is not being given by the government. But this is government spending driven growth. The question is, can that really address with an issue, a slump, which is either cyclical or could potentially become structural? If it's cyclical, perhaps, fine. But if it's structural, then you have a serious problem at hand. Then you're essentially looking at India's growth story taking a severe dent in the coming years. Of course, this is combined by 4 times the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, has cut its interest rates. There is, the streamlining of banks, which hopefully will increase lending, and generally trying to enthuse investors and the sector more broadly. That takes us to this next issue. Whether it succeeds or not, these policy measures need to be seen, but it has been acknowledged that there is a problem. The problem is not just economic, it leads directly back to the political landscape of India. This is a government which came to power on the promise of economic development. In 2014, for sure. In 2019, most definitely so, but it also had other political agendas, such as Article 317 Kashmir, etc. But economic development, if it does not deliver, and I think they are very acutely aware, if you don't deliver on the brass tack numbers, a confirmed victory in 2024 general election is not guaranteed. And with unemployment figures, by the way, the government of India has not released the unemployment data. It was supposed to release it before the elections in May 2019. It refused to release it. According to various estimates, it's 6.1%. It was in 2018, 11 million people jobless and increasing as we speak on a day-to-day basis. Now, this is serious, high levels of unemployment of people who have gotten serious high levels of education. So you're essentially looking at a demography of which 50% is youth. Many of them are educated, employable or not, I'm not going to comment on that, but educated, and most of them are struggling for jobs. Is it a demographic dividend you are looking at, or is it a demographic explosion, a huge cost as we move forward? These are the questions that are dominating the mind of Indian policy maker. Part of the reason, coming back to why the demand has gone down, the answer goes back, apart from the general, Indian propensity to save at a personal level. Indians love saving gold, under the blanket, and a cultural thing. But so that actually helps the economy, if you think about it. It weathered the 2009 recession very well. But this is something very different. In 2016, the government of India in November, the Prime Minister comes and says overnight, 501,000 rupee notes have been completely, they are out of circulation, they have been demonetized. And the Indian economy was running on 501,000 rupee notes. It creates a cascading effect. You're looking at an economy which is predominantly informal, where not everyone is working with bank accounts. You're looking at a huge informal sector where savings are kept in 1,000 rupee notes, which goes completely waste overnight. How do you deal with that situation? The reason given was, of course, terrorism financing, counterfeit cash has to be roped in, and generally going cashless. But when they actually did the math, all the money that they thought was counterfeit, it came back to the system. So that explanation that was given is not clear. But what it did was, it actually killed the purchasing power of a majority of Indians. Politically, it was a masterstroke. Because politically, it was justified as a tough decision taken by a strong leader, no political costs in the electoral ballot. But economically, it's like a snowballing effect. You take a decision once, and then it just continues, the effects continues to snowball and leads to this, essentially, in which there is just not enough demand coming from the ground. And this is very important for India, because the big strength of India is the strength of its market, its consumers, its domestic market. If that market is not flourishing, then you have a serious problem at hand. Forget FDI. You're looking at your own economy that may not really transform the way you wanted it to transform, regardless of the injections you put. This takes us to the third contradiction, which is a strategic contradiction. In the Q&A, one thing which becomes very important when I talk about these things is actually the decision-making processes. How does the government of India take decisions on politics, on economy, on foreign affairs, on security? We can go back to it. One of the flip sides, one of the strengths, of course, is there is centralized decision-making. There is someone who is clearly where the buck stops, which is the Prime Minister's office, a very strong office. But that can also be a problem. There's too much centralization of policy-making processes. And if you insulate yourself from opinions which are sometimes not what you want to hear, then it can lead to mistakes which can be really costly. We can come to that. The final contradiction that India, and any government in India, definitely the Modi government is dealing, are strategic contradictions. I've talked about a bit, I've given you an overview of the economy and the politics domestically. But how do you deal with a situation where you have two neighbors who are enduring rivals and adversaries, which is China and Pakistan, but you have also, and to contain them or to manage them, you need alignments, you need powerful friends internationally. Traditionally, Soviet Union was your benefactor. Today, it's American alignment with the United States. How do you deal with that? Because in principle, if not non-alignment, which is a Nehruvian kind of term and not really accepted by India's strategic community anymore, you want to still have strategic autonomy. You don't want to put all your eggs in Trump's basket. You need to have a working relationship, a good relationship with the Russians. You need to manage your relationship with China. You cannot continuously fight. But at the same time, you need to be aligned somewhere. India has traditionally favored soft alignments. Alignments which does not lead to any binding promises which comes with alliances, like proper treaty alliances. It has never done that. Today, over the past 5 years, what we have seen is there's been a contradictory, again, a very kind of interesting dynamic. On one hand, its relationship with the Chinese have actually deteriorated in many ways. It has a huge boundary dispute. If you look at the map, it's a huge, huge, huge boundary dispute with China, which gets heated up occasionally. Not just with the Modi government, but it does get heated up. In 2017, the government of India decided they're going to go forceful and tackle the Chinese aggression as they perceived it in a much more robust military manner. Now, if you're taking on the Chinese, you need to be equipped with the current, with adequate equipment. Although there are different ways the Indian Army operates along the line of actual control with China and the line of control with Pakistan. On LOC, they are armed. They can use fire, heavy and small arms. And as we speak, on a day-to-day basis, there is artillery fire going on, heavy artillery exchange going on between Pakistan and India. It's heavy and it's routine. Both the countries will fight each other. They'll cross into the other country's territory, do headhunting of other soldiers, take their heads back. It's really, really, really violent. It's like localized war of sorts. On line of actual control, neither the Chinese nor the Indians, despite the territory being disputed, use guns. Since 93, you will not see the two forces using weapons. They go for hand tugs. And that's actually a very good decision. Otherwise, this whole thing will be lit up. How do you deal with China, which is your economic competitor, which is a strategic competitor, which is supporting Pakistan at the United Nations on issues related to terrorism? It is supporting, it is the nuclear benefactor of Pakistan, and at the same time has a huge boundary dispute, but is also one of the most important economic partners of India. How do you segregate the two? And this is something that has become very difficult for India to manage. You cannot not have a relationship with China. You cannot disengage, but you cannot at the same time be seen as weak. Modi government's decision was to actually boycott a signature project of Xi Jinping, that was the Belt and Roads Initiative. India was the first and an enduring country which has actually said that this whole project has deep flaws. It's not a multilateral project. It's various bilateral projects, and essentially acting like, China acting like a very coercive economic power in which you give, like a loan shark, essentially, in which you give loans to smaller countries, and that gives you access into both policy making and territory. And that is why we would actually oppose it. But also because the road that they were building in this China-Pakistan economic corridor went through Kashmir. And India's position is that is basically, going against our territorial integrity. In that situation, a very highly polarized situation, With Pakistan, we all know things have come to a real February 27 this year. It was really, really close. I mean, I was following it in real time. This was when the two countries came very close for an accidental war. It is true that the Indians were really, they would have escalated had Pakistan not immediately de-escalated. So there is a recalibration happening of doctrines, of force. In that case, how do you deal with the contradiction that you're not aligned? How can you say that, look, we are fighting with the Chinese and the Pakistanis, but we are not with the Americans? And that is something that has been a constant issue of managing relationship between Washington, D.C. and India. As we go forward, this is a very important aspect of India's foreign policy. Do you invest more in the US, which is uncertain, we don't know what Trump would do? In Afghanistan, we don't know. India has been a virulent critic of the peace process, direct talks between the US and Taliban for a long time. And suddenly Trump comes and cancels the whole talks. Just one day, one night, the tweet comes, the talks are off the table. It has an explosive effect on how these countries deal with these situations. How much time do I have before I continue?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The other contradiction, because after this is my conclusion, very quickly. Fine, one thing is diplomatic balancing, whether it's at the United Nations, whether it's bilateral relations with big powers, and India is going out of its way to quote Russia. Recently, Modi met with Putin, and the idea was to make sure that Russia does not wean away from India because of its embrace with the Chinese. How do you deal with actual brass tack security issues? You have two neighbors. China, of course, militarily is way too powerful than you are, but Pakistan is not. Yet, despite being a rising power with such a huge, powerful military, a very important realization happened, at least among the analyst community, in February this year, that India flew a MiG-21 Bison to intercept an incoming Pakistani Air Force package of fighter jets. Now, MiG is a very old aircraft. For a country the size of India and ambition of India, using weaponry which is essentially obsolete in high-intensity battles is a problem. So we are looking at the other contradiction of maintaining deterrence, conventional deterrence. Of course, you have nuclear deterrence, but the scope of fighting within the nuclear umbrella between India and Pakistan is actually pretty high. So the question is, how do you maintain conventional deterrence when you actually have a capability deficit when it comes to your force capabilities? Most of India's defense equipment is imported. The indigenous arms industry is actually very, very nascent. And this becomes very central to the economic argument of making in India, this drive that you make in India. The fact remains that making in India, especially in the defense sector, they simply don't have the expertise and the skills and the know-how and the structural base to deliver that. Yet at the same time, you have enduring rivalry. So you do panic purchases of fighter jets from France. You go for very highly guided precision munition from Israelis. You do air defense from Russia. What does that lead to? Fine, you have the money, you have the economic muscle to buy that, but it leads to another kind of second-order effect, that when put together, these systems, which are from different manufacturers, may or may not deliver when time comes. And that was also witnessed on February 27th this year, when India actually shot down one of its own helicopters with military officials in it and lost, I think, I'm not sure of the figure, 19 soldiers in friendly fire because the systems didn't match. Now, this is this complete mismatch, or not complete, but considerable mismatch between a deeply ambitious, a very aspirational youth and political polity of big country in South Asia with internal policy, practical handicaps and capability deficits. It's something to watch out for in different sectors, in the economy, in politics, in defense, as you move forward. If policy decisions are taken to actually reduce this difference, which I think policy decisions are being taken to reduce this difference, then the India promise sustains. If not, then we are looking at a very, very complicated story in which we don't know which direction the country is likely to head. So this is just to conclude, that when you think about India, rather than thinking about this government or that government, this ideology or that ideology, corruption of this sort or that sort, it's better to think of the ambition and the mismatch. It's better to think in terms of what is the main enduring political conversation happening. What can that kind of conversation do? What can, for example, coming back home to United Kingdom, if you have Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister who's saying we have a deal, we will do a deal, when everyone is saying that no, there is no negotiation going for a deal with the United Kingdom under this Prime Minister, there is a mismatch. And that mismatch will have consequences for the UK. Similarly for India, the mismatch between what it promises or what people want it to be with what it is and what policies are being taken will be a continuous panning out process which you must keep an eye out on. Going back to what I was asked earlier, whether I'm positive or critical, I'm both positive and critical about India. It is a fantastic story in many ways. I'm an Indian citizen, so the fact that the country actually survived and thrived as a democracy, and it still does, if you think about it, is actually quite a miracle, given the diversity of this country. But there are issues. It's also one of the biggest costs that comes with such diversity, that you have to cater to different customer requirements, to use industry terms, which is not always easy. Thank you so much.